going to take a bit of a quick journey to start, and then get into some examples, and I'll just get us going. So the Ontario Heritage Trust, if you don't know us, we have a mandate that's set out in the Ontario Heritage Act, and it's noted there. We protect through conservation easement or direct ownership on behalf of the Crown 465 cultural and natural heritage properties across the province. We see about 800,000 participants a year in our events and activities, and we work with and in about 85% of Ontario's municipalities. We raise about 65% of our own funding, so Heather's reference to donors and sponsors and partners is absolutely true. We do a lot of work to raise that money. Our approach to heritage is an integrated one. The agency we are an agency of the Provincial Ministry of Tourism, Culture and Sport. We have an opportunity and a mandate to protect property of architectural, historical, archaeological, natural, scenic, aesthetic, and recreational interests. So we must take an integrated approach with that broad mandate, and you can see our vision there on the slide. In 2013, we're really looking at three themes. We're looking at whose story do we tell. So you'll have seen at our booth in your kits, you have a copy of our magazine talking about our 2017 program, My Ontario, A Vision Over Time, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. We're looking at what do we protect. So the discussion of value we're going to have today. And then in the fall, we're looking at intangible heritage. How do we actually safeguard intangible heritage for the future? And we'll be doing a special edition of our magazine and a fall symposium on that subject. So whose story do we tell? We've taken the 150th anniversary of Confederation and set it in the context of more than 10,000 years of history in what is now Ontario. And we're trying to change the narrative. So we're inviting many new voices to the discussion of history and heritage in the province. We're inviting all Ontarians to share their story in their own words with their own voice. Everyone has a story. Everyone's story is important, and we're asking Ontarians to be storytellers. And so we've opened a conversation with Ontarians about our experiences as Ontarians, and we're looking at collecting stories from all parts of the province, all parts of our history, and encouraging, as I say, people to talk in their own voice about their own experience. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about what's being protected. So growing from that discussion of stories, what are we actually protecting with our various mechanisms? What's meant by heritage value? We've seen some wonderful conservation projects over the last 2 days. Some of them are beautiful landmark projects. We've seen some wonderful buildings, and we've had some interesting conversations about inclusive approaches to heritage, about Indigenous heritage, about Franco-Ontarian heritage. And I'd like to look at our work from the perspective today of how we look at value. We're going to look at some international models about value. And I will note that, as I said, some of my slides have a lot of information and they're meant to be a bit of a resource for later. So what's designated? Some of you were in today's session about the Ontario Heritage Act Register. The Trust has the opportunity to run data through that register and get information about what's designated. So we looked initially at 10-year periods and ran for 1976, 86, 96, etc., the designations. And we did that specifically to share with you what we're seeing from those years. I cut them through every 20 years because the data was essentially running the same. We made some assumptions going into that the focus is on the monumental, it's on the grand, the unique, the rare, the one of a kind, the extraordinary, that it is that it is those things that we've identified to express our local and national identity. We also made some assumptions about the number of government buildings, commercial buildings, and residential buildings, and that the religious properties are primarily Christian. And I'm just going to show you a couple of year samples. We also made some assumptions that the focus is on Western European representations of architecture. And I'm not suggesting for a moment, and I'll say this at least once more, I'm not suggesting for a moment that these sites represented here should not be designated. They absolutely should be designated. What I'm suggesting is that we might also broaden that conversation to be a bit more inclusive. So what's missing from those slides? I want you to think about these questions. If we had a slightly different setup, we might throw this question out, but I'd like you to think about what's being protected in your community. Are there vernacular representations? Are there working class examples? Are there cultural landscapes or industrial landscapes? Are there indigenous sites? Are there sacred places? Are there places of spiritual value? Are there representations of other cultures within our society? And how is Indigenous heritage represented? Those of you who were in the session yesterday looking at Indigenous heritage, Dawn Setford said, everyone has made a contribution to the culture of the world, and she's looking for an inclusive, equal, respectful study of our collective history. Words like inclusive tend to be overlooked because they're used a lot. So equal and respectful and collective are good words to use instead. So I think it's true that the heritage we value is the heritage we fight for, it's the heritage we fund, it's the heritage we protect, we steward. And so how do we change our frameworks and our methodologies, maybe the questions we ask, the people that we include in the conversation, so that the values we're protecting are more equal, more representative, more respectful? And what happens when those values differ? I'm going to take you very quickly through a number of examples of definitions of the way this discussion is framed in materials you may or may not have seen, but you'll certainly be at least familiar with. So the Australian Heritage Council distinctly defines Indigenous heritage value. And again, I'm going to share these quickly. You can have a quick look there. In Canada, looking at standards and guidelines, his heritage value of the historic place lies along with its conditions, evolution over time, interrelationship between the historic place, its environment, and its communities should also be considered. Looking at the Canadian Register of Historic Places, they may have more than one heritage value. And then many of you work with this regulation, 9.6. The Trust works with 10.6, looking at provincial criteria, but the criteria are the same and they're there. So how do we apply those criteria, perhaps in different ways? So using a different lens, you're all familiar with the Borough Charter, I'm sure. I put it first because it was first adopted in 1979. So these questions are not new questions. But Australia has done some particularly interesting work as it relates to Indigenous culture, and so I wanted to specifically include it here. It was revised in 2013 and adopted by ICOMOS Australia. The image here is a Luru Kat, I can never quite say this, Kata Tajuta National Park, 1987, inscribed on the World Heritage List for its geological formations, its rare plants and animals, and its natural beauty. In 94, it was acclaimed for its cultural landscape. So as they learned more and the values grew related to this property, they didn't change it, but they did add to it. So it honors the traditional belief systems as part of one of the oldest human societies on Earth. So traditional knowledge is now combined with Western science in caring for that site. The Nara Declaration. So coming forward to 2013, we're going back to 1994. I didn't realize until Sean Fraser told me recently that Herb Stovall was a major voice at the table in developing the Nara Declaration. So the concept of authenticity varies from culture to culture, and therefore when authenticity is being assessed, it's the underlying cultural context that also has to be considered. And if you look at Section 5 of the Declaration, it talks about the protection and enhancement of cultural and heritage diversity in our world should be actively promoted as an essential aspect of human development. And then moving to New Zealand, the New Zealand Charter in 2010, and again you can see heritage values, cultural landscapes, structures, sacred places, and again a broader reference to heritage places. Still looking at different lenses, the U.S. National Parks Service. Particularly here I wanted to flag the traditions, beliefs, practices, life ways, arts, crafts, and social institutions make up the culture of a community. And then the need, first of all, to avoid Eurocentrism, and then to consult with groups and individuals who have special knowledge. And that's part of their process. This is Bulletin 38, but part of their process of developing their National Register of Historic Places. Just talk about Randall Mason for a moment. He talks about heritage conservation being best understood as a socio-cultural activity, not just a technical practice. And we get very involved in the technical and forget to step back and see it in its socio-cultural context. And he talks about the traditional modes of assessing significance rely heavily on historical, art historical, and archaeological approaches, and need to be more broadly inclusive of the needs of stakeholders, communities, and contemporary society. Neil Forbes, this is 2014, the Renewal, Innovation and Change Heritage and European Society Project. He was working out of Coventry. So again, my point in this slide is we've been asking these same questions for several years, and my question really is, okay, so now what? How do we actually take those questions and apply them to the processes that we're using? Some of you will be familiar with the work of Laura Jane Smith, her book, The Uses of Heritage, and some of her writing. Heritage as a way of knowing and seeing, and as a cultural construct. It's an overlay to history and the environment applied independently by each community. Right? So each community's value is important. Many of you will know Lisa Prosper, talking about the importance of understanding traditional knowledge and the oral narrative as part of the understanding of cultural landscape, and particularly Aboriginal cultural landscape. Ned Kaufman talks about story sites, and he sets up a conversation in his book, first of all, about story sites, and he looks at the value of story sites to convey, but he also talks about the ordinary places and the importance of ordinary places, canneries, factories, barbershops, hair salons, bars, retail stores, boardwalks, burial grounds, and that those places seldom receive designation, but they need to be recognized in our society. And he sets out a useful survey process for story sites, which he calls storyscape surveys. And he starts with the story or the theme and connects that then to place, and works with a range of professionals and community knowledge holders, for want of a better word, to ensure community participation and to ensure that that oral history, that oral tradition is captured. He draws on a lot of examples from New York City and the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. This is an example from Hamilton Heights, Sugar Hill Historic District, which was a row house development, low-rise apartment buildings that supplanted farmland between 1886 and 1906. And affluent black families flourished there in the 1930s, with Sugar Hill in particular, an eastern enclave of Hamilton Heights and part of the Harlem Renaissance, and this is a designated district. So what can we learn from others? I'm going to take very quickly through some Australian examples, Halifax, historic England, the Mecca Flats in Chicago, and a few others, but to really look at the need to engage a range of stakeholders and other authorities who attach importance to heritage places, to make sure that we have a shared understanding of the collective values so that we have better conservation outcomes in the long term. And the values and priorities that stakeholders attribute to heritage places are at times in conflict, and how do we deal with that? Again, I'm going to say, what we value is what we protect, it's what we fund, it's what we steward. So we have to make sure that our values are sufficiently inclusive, that parts of our communities are not being left out. So Australia talks about national heritage value, and I specifically flagged for you section 3, the regulations prescribe specific criteria for these 3 areas: natural heritage, cultural heritage, natural heritage, indigenous heritage, and historic heritage values of places. So staying then with the national heritage criteria, one of the things that Australia has developed is a really significant guide that provides definitions, it provides notes and examples on how you take the criteria and you actually apply them across the country. And so they're looking for strong or special association with particular community or cultural group, and the importance of cultural and natural history in the Indigenous tradition. There's a shared heritage project that I thought we might learn something from. The councils recognize that many places hold significant history to both Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, that very often the history is a shared one, and sometimes that shared history has conflicting values, depending on who you're talking to. They recognize that every place in Victoria has an Aboriginal history and acknowledge places that have that shared history. So rather than just building on top of it and ignoring that it ever existed, recognizing that every place has an Aboriginal history. And also recognizing that stories and memory about events and places, again, may conflict. They may be divergent and may conflict. So they've established assessment guidelines for landscapes of cultural heritage significance for the Victorian Heritage Register. The Uluru example is a good one. I had a slide up earlier that had that particular site, and they have created a joint management between the government of Australia and the Aboriginal community, and they have established a management plan that takes them from 2010 to 2020 specifically for that site. Coming to Canada, looking at Halifax. Halifax has a centre plan. I have to say they have a very fun YouTube video that I thought about showing, but I didn't want to get into the technical hassles of trying to do that. So you can see it on YouTube, and it's called the Centre Plan. But they've looked at specifically working together with the community with the Indigenous communities and other cultural groups to develop protocols that are specific for the identification, protection, and commemoration of areas and sites relevant to their diverse history, traditional practices, and activities in the present day, and also with the African, Nova Scotian, Acadian, and other cultural communities to identify, protect, and commemorate areas that have shared significance. So some really interesting work happening in Halifax. England. Historic England has created 4 heritage initiatives that I thought might be of interest. Historic England is committed to bringing greater attention to the histories of marginalized, under-researched, and underrepresented groups whose contributions are not properly acknowledged. And you can see the 4 areas that they've chosen: pride of place, so the LGBTQ heritage of England, the slave trade and abolition, disability history, and women's history, which alas is still underrepresented. Their pride of place initiative, you can see the description there. It recognizes that the LGBTQ heritage needs to be identified, it needs to be recorded and understood, cared for and celebrated as part of the national identity of England. And this is an initiative that's been led by a team of historians and scholars at Leeds Beckett University's Center for Culture and the Arts. And I was in a session this morning, I was pleased to hear that Glenn Crawford is working with Ottawa, the city of Ottawa, to inventory and create a mobile app for LGBTQ sites in Ottawa. Their Sites of Memory project, Black British history in 18th and 19th centuries. They recognize that the history of Black people during this period in England, they worked as servants, they worked as tradespeople, business people, some of them, not all of them, some of them were enslaved. But they also look at the people who made their fortunes from slavery and the slave trade, along with those who worked to abolish it. So a very interesting and different look at that. And this is the anti-slavery arch in Stroud. Historic England has an Enrich the List campaign. I actually thought this was pretty brave. This is a 2016 undertaking. It lives on Twitter, and it encourages people to add information about sites that are on the list. So if you have a photo, you have a story about a site that's on the list, you're invited to share those, and someone in Historic England checks them all. And if, in fact, it adds useful information to the list, they add that. I thought that was an interesting but brave undertaking. Mecca Flats in Chicago. This is an interesting story about giving voice and place to intangible heritage and intangible culture. The intersection between race, place, and culture, a 1940s effort of African Americans to save the Mecca Flats in Chicago, an apartment building that was the subject of popular blues music. And this is has been the subject of some of the work of Daniel Bluestone, some really interesting writing about Chicago's Mecca Flats blues. It was threatened by and ultimately lost to Mies van der Rohe's designs for the Illinois Institute of Technology. All right, Canada. So the context we're working in today, I have to say I always start with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's not really any more basic than equality. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms guarantees the rights and freedoms equally to all, and recognizes and affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of Canada's Aboriginal peoples. I could go sit down now because that's really the discussion right there. But I did want to mention some other things. The 2014 Supreme Court case, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce this. I've tried. Sean's going to pronounce it. Do you know how to pronounce this?
Please pronounce it
Chilcotin? Okay. This case is really fascinating. If you have not seen it, if you haven't read it, it's very interesting. It looks at how pre-sovereignty rights and interests can properly find expression in modern common law. So how do you take two perspectives and two legal frameworks and have them make sense in today's world? The case looked at Aboriginal culture and practices and compared them in a culturally sensitive way to what was required by common law to establish title. It accepted oral tradition as evidence. is really, really important. It accepted oral tradition as evidence and found that Aboriginal title had, in fact, been established, and that the honour of the Crown meant that they were required to consult not only on the uses of the land, but also to accommodate their interests in the decisions made. Really, really important case, very, very interesting to read. As an agency that holds land on behalf of the Crown, the honour of the Crown has a specific meaning to me and to the team that I work with. But it should also have a meaning to those of you who work in consultation, who consult for governments, and to any of us that simply care about how rights are protected. I'm going to take only a moment to talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report of 2015. It has been mentioned a couple of times over the course of the conference. If you haven't read the findings, I encourage you to read them. I encourage you to read the history section if you do not know this history. Two things I wanted to specifically mention. The recommendations are actually calls to action. So they're taking us a step further. The first is that we adopt the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And the other one I encourage you to look specifically at is call to action number 79. And it's targeted specifically at the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada in its initial phrasing. I think it's a call for all of us. It's to expand representation on the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada to include First Nations, Métis, and Inuit representatives, to revise the policies of the National Program of Historical Commemoration to integrate Indigenous history, heritage, values, and memory practices into Canada's national heritage and history, and to develop and implement a national heritage plan and strategy for the commemoration of residential school sites, the history and legacy of residential schools, and the contributions of Aboriginal peoples to Canada's history. So it's fairly easy to sit back and say, well, that's the federal government and they'll take care of that for us. But it is in fact a call for all of us to take action in that regard. So in whatever part of our responsibility that sits, we should be stepping up to that call. I'm going to mention quickly this image is a Syrian reunion in Toronto at our Ashbridge estate. We were having a barbecue, and the woman in blue is a BBC correspondent who had filmed the issues of the Syrian refugees trying to get out of Syria the year before. And one of the little boys at the reunion went up to her and said, "What is your name?" And she thought he was just playing a game. She said, "Well, what's your name?" And he ran away. And he came back a moment later with his family, who she had interviewed in Syria as they were trying to escape. And so she shared, and we have all shared now, the story of these Doucette and the reunion at Ashbridge. I think this is an interesting story about expanding interpretation and expanding understanding. This is Brock's Monument. Everybody knows Brock's Monument. We'll start earlier. Let me just find the right page here. First monument was 1827. The second monument was 1859. In 1912, there was a celebration, a centennial celebration of the Battle of Queenston Heights, which was attended by chiefs and senior representatives of the Six Nations. And yet still, the significant contribution of the Haudenosaunee people had not been recognized. In 1994, the Ontario Heritage Trust unveiled a provincial plaque on the efforts of the Coloured Corps through the War of 1812. We still hadn't reflected the Indigenous contribution. In between 2005 and 2007, this memorial appeared at the foot of the monument commemorating Six Nations, and it would move from time to time. Sometimes it would disappear and it would reappear. If someone took it away, it would reappear. It was a quiet protest, a quiet commemoration of the really significant contribution of the Haudenosaunee, in particular the Six Nations. And then in 2016, the Landscape of Nations Monument is unveiled, and that's the one that's shown at the bottom. And it's just one image. It's a large and impressive monument that was designed collaboratively, and I use this example to demonstrate the change in the values that we recognize for this property and how the commemoration has grown and changed over time. What's happening in Ontario? So we're seeing, whoops, slide ahead, sorry. We're seeing cultural landscape inventories and studies in a number of communities, a number of your communities. We're seeing cultural mapping in a number of communities as well. And these are important in bringing forward stories, new stories that need to be recognized, new stories that need to be protected and preserved. The Bala Falls example is a good one. Who knows the Bala Falls story? Okay, I won't spend a lot of time talking about the background. What's important here is the CRB decision. So the CRB report I thought was important enough to reflect here in its summary. The key piece here is the phrase that says the challenge is transferring the spirit and sense of place elements of the valued natural environment and scenic beauty into the real property, heritage attributes, buildings or structures type definitions and provisions that constitute the Act. So how do you translate a site like this to the Act, and how do you then protect it? So the evidence of human intervention is not the only thing that holds value when you look at something like Bala Falls, and that's true for many, many of the sites that are in our communities and we're hoping will be protected in our communities. If you were in Sean Fraser's presentation yesterday, you would have learned a bit about the Oro African Church Preservation Project, which is shown here. This was, you can read the story there, but what's interesting to me is that I've now heard Sama Othman and Mayor Hughes talk about this project several times, and it is the importance of the story of the site that brings support around it. The work that they did drew not just local interest or provincial interest, but national and international interest to the site. They raised well over $100,000 for the preservation of the site after their council said no to funding. And they were able to not only ensure its long-term conservation, ensure its restoration, but carry that story then out into the community in many, many ways. The Ontario Heritage Trust recognized this project last year through the Lieutenant Governor's Ontario Heritage Awards, not only with a Community Leadership Award, but also an award for excellence in conservation. And it is the first time we've given that award to the same, both awards to the same project. This is the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School, which is in Brantford. It's part of the Mohawk Cultural Institute, and it was a residential school from 1828 to 1970. And this story, again, they have created a campaign to save the evidence of the residential school. This comes out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's challenge that these stories be held, that they be conserved, that we not lose track of the story of the residential schools, and that their communities and our communities understand this story. And so they have undertaken a program of renovations to ensure that the physical evidence is retained and that the story can be told through this site. I've been in this site. It has a heavy heart. It's the only way I can describe it. It has a heavy heart. But it is an important story, and I've heard survivors of the residential school system in this school tell their stories in this site, and it's part of the work that we all must now do to ensure that that story is told. If you know Carolyn King, From the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation, you will know this project. She's passionate about the Moccasin Identifier Project. Key phrase for her is know whose land you're on. And so she's undertaken a project to identify by moccasin symbols the land across cities and towns that is in Indigenous territory, that is the territory of First Nations or the territory of Métis communities, so that people know whose land they're standing on. And her story is that essentially, how does anyone recognize us? How does anyone recognize that they're in one of our territories if we don't have a way to tell them? And so this story is an interesting project that, again, we all have ways that we could support. So I'm going to say it again, in case you didn't hear it the first time. I'm not suggesting that the sites that are currently listed and designated in our communities should not be listed and designated in our communities. They are important. They're important contributions. They represent important contributions to the story of our communities. What I'm saying is, it's a bigger story than that, and we need to figure out how to be more inclusive, to be more respectful, and to find ways to tell our collective story in different ways, and to recognize that the statements of significance that we develop may have other perspectives. There may be other stories that we're not capturing, other parts of the story that we're not telling. So how do we broaden that framework? All right, so what can you do in your community? What can I do at the Trust? What can you do in your organizations? I'm just going to tell you quickly, this photo is Whanakona. Whanakona is now the resting place of 1,760 ancestors of the Huron-Wendat Nation who were brought here for a significant ossuary reburial of 12 communities of the Huron-Wendat Nation. We brought them together in 2013 for an Aboriginal burial, to create an Aboriginal burial area for those communities with the Huron-Wendat Nation. And this now very peaceful place is and was sacred land and will continue to be for the Wendat Nation. So, are you thinking about your own communities? Here are a few thoughts. I'm going to run through these. I think the first is to figure out what's in our portfolios, whether it's land we own or land we protect or land that's in our registers. What's there? What's protected? What's listed? What's not? And identify the gaps. So I will say that the Ontario Heritage Trust is starting this process right now. We've done some work already on assessing the properties that we own. We've looked at the easement properties. We've looked at the sites that we have provincial plaques on and the stories we tell through provincial plaques. And we're looking ahead to what does that look like going forward. And we've also, if you're not aware of it, and I talked about it very briefly at the beginning, the My Ontario, A Vision Over Time is intended to create a collection that we hope will help to guide us as we plan for the future in terms of the stories that we tell and the sites that we protect. We're hoping that that will help to guide us. But it's not just look at our own list, then open conversations. So what do the conversations look like, and who are they with? Which cultural groups? Which Indigenous peoples? Which First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities whose history isn't reflected? Know what other inventories exist in your community. Are there people out there like Glenn, who's in Ottawa would know this because it's their project, but are there people who are gathering information about the LGBTQ community and the sites that are important? Women's history and the sites that are important, Black history. If your community is specifically of German background, are those sites identified? Who's got inventories? Treat assessments of value as living documents. We've seen how our understanding can change over time. So it means we need to not just create the document, create the statement of significance and put it in a drawer, but bring it out and look at it. Is it thorough? Have we learned something through our study, through our investigation, through archaeology, through our architectural investigations, or through our community discussions that have changed our understanding of that site? Do we need to revisit the models we're using for designation, for conservation? What questions are we asking, and who are we asking them of? And who's at the table with us when we ask those questions? Whose values are represented? Whose values aren't? How do we open those conversations? And one of the suggestions made earlier in the presentation is that some sites may need statements of significance to really capture the values held by different partners or different perspectives on a specific site. What about municipal guidelines for the application of the criteria? I'm not suggesting we open the Ontario Heritage Act again. Not at this point. I think we can take the regulations that we have and we can create and develop guidelines that are specific to your own community. And you can see I've referenced the Australia Heritage Council guidelines as an example. They're a good sample. The Trust has 50, I think it's 50 questions and 50 pages of criteria that we look at when we're applying 10.6. And we were talking a couple of weeks ago about the need to get that on the website so that you can access it if it's helpful to you. Cultural landscape approaches. If you haven't seen the issue of Heritage Matters that we did in the fall of last year, it might be useful to you in just thinking differently about a cultural landscape as a context, a different context for consideration of a site. Looking at it from all parts, all sides, looking at it from the outside, looking at it from its context, the viewscapes. And are easements a better protection tool than designation in some instances? Probably. So the Trust has an opportunity to use easements for provincially significant sites. You have opportunities to use easements within your communities as well. What about the Municipal Heritage Committee? Does it include different perspectives, different backgrounds? Are the interests and expertise kind of the same, or are they different? How do we do that? We've been looking very closely at the board of the Ontario Heritage Trust and looking at how we can bring different voices to that table to work with us in the work that we're doing. And I encourage you to do the same. Who's involved in our assessments? Talked about this a little bit in terms of whose values, but how do we know whose values? So which communities have been identified? Which people have been identified? Have they been given opportunities to provide perspectives, comments, data, oral history, traditional knowledge, to share their knowledge? And then how is it used? Is it, thank you very much, check. I consulted, check. Or is it actually a conversation which draws them in, which respects the traditional knowledge, which respects the oral history, which respects the documentation they may have that may differ from our own? And then examples like Historic England, where you use themes and stories as a starting point. So you look at a theme or a story in your community and say, well, that's an important story in our community. What are the physical representations of that? How do we commemorate that site, or how do we protect those sites that are representative of that theme, of that value? Others? Any other thoughts about how you can apply that in your community? There is a mic there that I understand to be live. Other thoughts about how you can apply that in your community? Or any questions? Sleep. I told you they'd be asleep. Pasta salad, potato salad, and sandwiches for lunch, and then out for a quick walk. I figured 2:15 probably you were out.
Does anyone have any questions? Please come up to the mic if there's a question.
Or comments, any thoughts about how this can work differently? Mary? There's a mic right there in front of Sean.
good height. My name's Mary Tybee. I'm with Heritage Guelph and Heritage Bristlinch. And, sorry, Sean. I suppose my question is really, what do we do when those cultural groups have left very little tangible heritage that we would identify under the Ontario Heritage Act? And I'm thinking particularly in my community of Guelph, which was at one time inhabited by the Adirondacks, and they are no longer present. We give voice to that information, but besides sticking plaques in different parts of the community, I'm not sure, okay, I'll round this up, but when the residue of that community comes together, the heritage that they display is pretty much intangible.
Mm-hmm.
It's music, food, language, dance. So that's my question. Is there some way within the OHA that this kind of thing can stay within that rather than going over to the multicultural group?
I would say under the criteria for 9.6, probably not. But are there other ways to preserve that intangible expression? And that's why I mentioned it's one of the things we're looking at in the fall. The stewardship of intangible heritage is a really significant topic right now. I don't know that we have the answers, and I don't believe we have the legislative framework or the regulatory framework yet. And one of the reasons we're particularly shining a spotlight on it in the fall is to try to figure out what do we need to provide protection mechanisms to be able to steward those intangible expressions with First Nation and Métis communities in Ontario, with other communities that whose tradition is in fact held in intangible forms. I don't have the answers to that yet. It's an important question. And you're right, you can't just stick plaques up everywhere. Although we do try to use our provincial plaque program to tell some of those stories. That's not the only answer. We try to make sure that in all of the work that we do, whether it's writing an article in the magazine, whether it's bringing a story forward in the work that we're doing, we try to make sure that those perspectives are all there. And so when we looked at cultural landscapes, we looked at the voice of the Cree, we looked at the voice of the Chippewa-Nawash, both of whom we're working with right now, and tried to ensure that their stories were part of the magazine and part of the discussion. So some of it is not just capture it in a moment of time and plaque it, but make sure that it's part of our living expression of history as we know it.
Just a point. Wrong height.
If you have a question, you might be in trouble.
Better height. Just a follow-up on that.
Yeah.
Mary, sorry. Just take it like that. I'm thinking about Indigenous heritage and the Act, and very often there are cultural landscapes, and if we look at the Bala example, it's a combination of natural and cultural, but so much of that place's value is natural. So Bala sort of opens the door to natural environments that have cultural associations with people. They may have attributes that are primarily natural, but they could be designated. They could be identified under the Planning Act as a landscape, but they could be designated under the Heritage Act as a landscape. And further, what's really important about these places is their place in our collective memory, the name of the place. If there was a particular ridge, a particular landform, a particular lake or area that was either sacred or of traditional use, and had a name in the language, preserving that name, and perhaps the landscape is very important. The Trust has done some work with the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation up on the Bruce Peninsula. There's a point that is held sacred to the Nawash. It's a long time burial and site of healing. And for them, very much getting the name reasserted was vital. And there's actually a process of going through that through the Geographical Naming Board in Ontario, where you can formally start a process to do that. And they've got an Indigenous naming priority. So I think the naming piece is important, but also considering landscapes that might look fairly natural as having cultural associations. In the same way that we think of Group of 7 landscapes as looking very natural, but having strong cultural associations. I think the Act needs to be tested.
So we're not going to change it, we're going to test it. I'm just going to add quickly for Sean's example, that site that we hold and co-manage with the Chippewa of Nawash, went from being known as Hunter's Point, who was the developer who was trying to make it into cottage lots, and it was known by the community as Hunter's Point. It's now Nochimawaning, and we won't call it anything else. They won't call it anything else either. And changing the name is an important part of it.
There's one last question.
Yeah.
Tomorrow.
My question was, and it's, I think you're the exact person to ask this question to, which is, we've seen, I think, at the municipal level.
Can you use the microphone?
Okay.
So tomorrow's talking about the municipal level.
So I was just going to say that I think at the municipal level, we've embraced the regulation 906. They've had the 10 years plus experience. I don't think we could say the same of provincial significance. I today still do not understand what is provincially significant with the lack of the minister using her or his authority. What's the opportunity in the future of engaging the trust when we in municipalities have resources that we know that are provincially significant, but there's no vehicle to do that?
So tomorrow's quite right. The minister has yet to use her power to designate provincially. The Ontario Heritage Trust does use provincial significance as a guide, both for commemorative topics, but also for ownership and easement discussions. We have a broader, our mandate under the trust is broader than designation under 10.6, so it's for us it's an opportunity, and we treat it as an opportunity. We have we have measures that we apply for consideration of commemorative topics, but we also have this list of 50 questions that we apply when we're looking at a site for trust ownership or trust protection, and as I say, we're happy to share that with you. I would say the opportunity for conversation between municipalities and the trust is call us. We're absolutely open to those conversations, but I think Sean's right, we need to test the Act in terms of what it can do for us, but I would say that we need to test it in the areas where we think we can actually take it. And so we're happy to work with any of you on provincial significance discussions in terms of the context of the trust's powers, as opposed to the ministry's powers. Any other questions? Thank you. You've been very patient.
And challenging us all to think about how we can expand the way we think about our own lists, registers, and the work we're doing to make sure it is more meaningful, respectful, and inclusive. So thank you very much. On behalf of the conference, we have a small before we head off, I'd just like to invite Virginia McLeod from Sault Ste. Marie to come up and say a few words about next year's conference. So please stay put for a couple more minutes. You don't want to miss this.
Hi, I'm Chris Norfolk from Sault Ste. Marie, and really an invitation here because in 2018 it'll be 30 years since the conference was last held in Sault Ste. Marie. And that was a LACAC conference, of course, and it was the last one because CHO was actually, if not born, was conceived at that particular meeting. So once again, we're going to hosting on the anniversary. We'd like you, we need you actually to come and join us. And I'm not going to tell you where Sault Ste. Marie is, except to say somewhere perhaps at the junction of Lake Superior and Lake Huron. And it's a 1 hour and a quarter flight by porter or a 7.5-hour car ride from Toronto. So anyway, we want you. In addition to, we have Parks Canada, we have Sulocks, we have some of the finest, I mean really finest Richardson, Romanesque, industrial, commercial buildings in the province, if not further. We're well on the way to securing our speakers, which I think will engage, motivate you, maybe entrance you, I don't know. And as you can see from the images, I think we do have a stunning location. We say naturally gifted, and looking forward to your support, looking to see you in June of next year. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'd just like to invite Sally Kutz up to close for the session.
Thank you, Heather. On behalf of the City of Ottawa, I would like to thank everybody here for attending our conference. It was a great pleasure to host you here in the nation's capital in 2017, and 150th anniversary of Confederation. And I'd also like to take a special moment to thank our organizers. A few years ago, it was decided that it would be great to have this conference this year in 2017, and I said it was a great idea, and then I proceeded to rely or pass it completely over to other people. So I want to especially thank our co-chairs, Ashley and Anne, who did a much better job than I ever would have been able to do. So it was the wisest thing I ever did. We started out with Leslie Collins. We also started out with Leslie Collins. She was very active, and I'd like to thank the organizing committee, many of whom are still here. So David Maloney, Heather Thompson, Carolyn Quinn, Julie Harris, Amber Poliquin, Marcus Letourneau, Laura Mueller, and again Leslie, who started out as one of the chairs. So and Adrian Phillips, our summer student, and some of our other volunteers. Everybody worked extremely hard to get this conference organized. So again, I thank them very, very sincerely, and thank you again.